A man stands in the rain outside a pizzeria. Through the window, he can see children celebrating, parents relaxing, animatronic characters singing on a small stage. The building represents safety in every visible detail. Nice colors, familiar branding, the kind of place where families go to create happy memories. But the man understands something those parents inside will learn too late. Places designed to protect children can become perfect hunting grounds because no one expects danger. The man's name is William Afton. Over the next 40 years, he will claim the lives of at least a dozen young victims, completely dismantle his business partner's life, sacrifice his own family to his obsession with immortality, and refuse to perish, even when his body is crushed in mechanical failures, consumed by building fires, and dragged into what might be hell itself. His story defines the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise because William Afton represents something more terrifying than any haunted animatronic. He represents what happens when someone with predatory instincts gains institutional authority. When someone who fears death more than anything decides other people's lives are acceptable costs for his survival. And when evil persists across decades, not because it's supernatural, but because systems keep enabling it. In this video, we're going to trace William Afton's complete timeline from partnership with Henry Emily through multiple identities, deaths, and resurrections. By the end, you'll understand how a single man's pathology created cascading tragedies that possessed machines, destroyed families, and proved that some horrors don't need supernatural explanations. They just need opportunity, access, and the willingness to treat human beings as experimental subjects, rather than as people deserving protection. If you're watching this to go to sleep, let me know what part of the world you are in, and what time it is for you. It's cool to know this content helps people all over the globe get some much-needed rest. So now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Partnership. Before William Afton murdered anyone, before the haunted animatronics and the decades of horror, there were two men who wanted to make children happy. One of them genuinely meant it. The other understood that organizations built around children's entertainment could serve purposes their public mission statements would never acknowledge. William Afton and Henry Emily met in the mid-1970s and discovered complementary skill sets that seemed destined for successful partnership. Henry was the engineer, the creative genius who could transform theoretical concepts into functioning machines. He understood robotics, animatronic movement systems, programming, all the technical elements required to make metal and plastic seem alive enough to enchant children. William handled business operations, finances, marketing, and administrative structures that would allow Henry's creations to become profitable enterprises. The partnership seemed natural. Henry needed someone to manage aspects of business he found tedious. William needed access to Henry's technical brilliance to build the kind of establishment that would generate sustainable revenue. Together, they created Fredbear's Family Diner and established what would eventually become Fazbear Entertainment. Understanding what happens next requires understanding how family entertainment venues function as trust proxies. Parents teach children to be wary of strangers, to never accept gifts from people they don't know, to stay within sight of adults they trust. These protective instincts are strong and developmentally appropriate, but those same parents teach children that certain contexts override these rules, that people wearing costumes at restaurants designed for families have been vetted by the establishment, that commercial settings with corporate branding represent safety because businesses have reputational interests in protecting customers, that the presence of other families creates collective oversight, making predation unlikely. This psychological framework is exactly what William Afton would learn to exploit. Predators don't need to overcome children's defensive instincts if they can position themselves within manufactured safety contexts that parents have already taught their children to trust. A stranger in a parking lot triggers alarm responses. That same stranger wearing a company costume inside a pizzeria designed for children becomes someone kids are encouraged to approach, someone associated with fun and safety, rather than danger. William Afton was learning these dynamics during Fredbear's early operations. He watched how parents relaxed vigilance inside the establishment. He observed how children gravitated toward the costume characters without hesitation. He noticed that back rooms existed where employees could access costumes and equipment without customer observation. And he recognized that Henry's idealism created blind spots that could be exploited if someone wanted to use the business's infrastructure for purposes contradicting its stated mission. Henry designed Fredbear's family diner to be magical for children. The animatronic characters would perform songs, tell stories, and create experiences that became core childhood memories associated with joy and wonder. This motivation was genuine. Henry loved children in the healthy, protective way that drives people to create entertainment that enriches young lives without exploiting them. That authentic care for children's well-being made it psychologically impossible for Henry to imagine that his business partner might want to use their shared creation for opposite purposes. This is cognitive blindness common among people who've never encountered true predatory psychology. When you build something from genuine idealism, you assume collaborators share that idealism. You don't install safeguards against partners using your creations to harm the people you're trying to protect, because modeling that possibility requires understanding motivations so foreign to your own psychology that they seem impossible rather than merely unlikely. William Afton was different. His relationship with the business had always been more transactional than Henry's. William saw opportunity where Henry saw calling. The animatronics that Henry designed to protect and entertain children represented something else to William. Mechanisms that could be structured to enable access, that could fail in ways difficult to prosecute as intentional harm, that could serve multiple purposes depending on who controlled them and what that person actually wanted to accomplish. The spring-lock suits represented the first major decision point where these different motivations created consequences. Henry designed Spring Bonnie and Fredbear as innovative solutions to a practical problem. Animatronic characters could perform programmed routines, but they couldn't adapt to unexpected situations or interact with children in genuinely responsive ways. Employees wearing costumes could interact naturally, but simple fabric suits lacked the visual impact of full animatronic characters. Spring-lock suits solved both problems by functioning as animatronics during performances and converting to wearable costumes when employees needed to interact directly with customers. The mechanism was ingeniously dangerous. Metal components filled the suits when in animatronic mode. Spring locks held these components in compressed positions when employees wore the suits, creating just enough interior space for a human body. But the spring locks were catastrophically unstable. Moisture could trigger them. Sudden movements could cause failure, and when spring locks failed while someone wore the suit, compressed mechanical parts would snap back into place with tremendous force, impaling the wearer on metal rods, crushing them with gears and crossbeams, killing them in ways that looked like tragic accidents rather than design flaws indicating the suits should never have been approved for human occupancy. The spring-lock suits had accidents, multiple accidents. Employees were injured, some fatally, when the mechanisms triggered during performances or while putting the suits on. These incidents were documented, investigated by workplace safety officials, and resulted in settlements paid to victims' families. But they were never prosecuted as criminal negligence or as evidence that the suit design was fundamentally unsafe. Instead, they were framed as user error. Employees who hadn't followed proper procedures, who'd made mistakes that more careful operators could avoid. This pattern established something William Afton would remember and exploit later: deaths occurring through mechanical failure were treated as accidents rather than crimes. Institutional responses focused on liability management rather than criminal investigation. And the right documentation and corporate structure could insulate decision makers from consequences, even when their equipment was killing people. William learned that springlock failures were terrible, but legally defensible tragedies rather than prosecutable offenses. He learned that companies could continue operating after employee deaths as long as they implemented training improvements and updated safety protocols. And he learned that mechanisms designed for one purpose could serve entirely different functions. If the person controlling them wanted outcomes, the mechanisms weren't officially designed to produce. Fredbear's family diner was successful enough that William and Henry began planning expansion. They developed new characters for a larger venue. Freddy Fazbear, Vany, Chica, and Foxy would populate Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. These new animatronics would be purely mechanical, safer to operate than springlock suits but limited to programmed performances rather than direct human interaction. The shift away from springlock technology at the new location suggests Henry recognized the suits were too dangerous for widespread use, though the original Fredbear and Spring Bonnie suits remained in service at the family diner for special occasions. Fazbear Entertainment was officially established as a corporate entity with William and Henry as co-founders. Revenue streams from dining, arcade games, and party bookings created sustainable profit. Everything seemed to validate their partnership and Henry's vision for bringing joy to children through innovative animatronic entertainment. But underneath successful business growth, something was crystallizing in William's psychology that would transform the entire franchise into a nightmare spanning decades. William was watching Henry interact with children and seeing genuine warmth and connection that William couldn't replicate. He was observing his own children and recognizing that no amount of material advantage was producing the family bonds he witnessed in other households. And instead of recognizing these observations as evidence of his own emotional deficits, William began developing theories about consciousness, death, and whether life essence could be extracted from one person and transferred to another through the right combination of trauma and mechanical intervention. This is where William Afton's pathology becomes clear enough to name. He wasn't someone who would eventually lose control and commit impulsive violence. He was someone who'd begun constructing elaborate intellectual frameworks that would allow him to commit atrocity while maintaining psychological distance from moral reality. The theories about life essence and immortality weren't delusions disconnected from reality. They were rationalizations, carefully crafted permission structures that would let William do what he wanted to do while telling himself he was pursuing important knowledge rather than satisfying predatory urges. Every element was in place. William had built institutional infrastructure, giving him access to vulnerable children in environments where their parents' protective instincts were deliberately relaxed. He had costumes making him appear trustworthy and hiding his identity from security cameras. He had back rooms and storage areas that weren't monitored. He had legal structures that would treat deaths as accidents rather than crimes. And he had a business partner whose idealism made him incapable of recognizing that their shared institution could serve purposes contradicting everything Henry believed they were building together. William Afton just needed a trigger, something that would push him from theoretical frameworks into actual violence. That trigger would come from tragedy in Henry's family. Henry's daughter was about to be murdered, and the person who killed her would use every structural advantage William and Henry had built into Fredbear's family diner. The costume designed to make children feel safe would become a predator's disguise. The trust proxy of family entertainment venues would make the victim lower her defenses, and engineered trust would let the killer operate without immediate detection. What William would learn from Charlotte Emily's murder was that he'd been right. The systems he'd helped create could enable violence. The frameworks he'd developed could be tested, and the consequences he'd feared might not materialize as long as he was careful about how he operated within institutional protections. that weren't designed to defend against someone exploiting them from inside positions of authority. Chapter 2. Charlotte, Emily, and the Prototype Murder. Charlotte Emily was Henry's only child, the center of his world in ways that made everything else feel secondary. She'd grown up inside the pizzeria environment where her father worked. Every positive association children are supposed to develop with family entertainment venues was amplified, in Charlotte's case because her father had literally built this world. The animatronic characters represented his love, expressed through creation. Fredbear's family diner represented his desire to make children happy. For Charlotte, the pizzeria wasn't just a restaurant, it was an extension of her father's care. This made her psychologically vulnerable in ways that would prove fatal. Children develop safety assessments based on environmental cues. Familiar locations feel safe. Spaces associated with parents feel protected. Branded commercial establishments signal adult supervision and vetting. Charlotte had every reason to believe that anything connected to her father's diner represented security rather than threat. On the night she died in 1983, Charlotte was outside Fredbear's family diner. The specific circumstances that led to her being locked out remain unclear, but the psychological mechanism is evident. She could see other children inside through the windows, could see the celebration happening, the animatronics performing, all the visual markers that signaled safety and fun. But something had separated her from the protected interior space where parental supervision existed and security functioned. This created specific psychological vulnerability. Charlotte wasn't lost in an unfamiliar area where stranger danger instincts would be active. She was outside her father's establishment, probably confused about why she couldn't get back inside, likely feeling frustrated rather than frightened. Her defensive psychology had no reason to activate because nothing about the situation suggested actual danger. She was at her father's business. Adults she knew were nearby. This should have been safe. When the spring Vany character appeared in the rain, Charlotte had every reason to trust what she was seeing. The yellow rabbit costume was familiar from performances inside the diner. Spring Vany represented her father's work, his creativity, the magic he created for children. The character approaching her would have registered as help arriving rather than as threat emerging. Every lesson Charlotte had learned about trust told her this was acceptable, that costume characters at her father's establishment were safe, that people associated with the diner were there to help her, that approaching this familiar figure made sense given her situation. William Afton was wearing the spring Vany suit. The costume served multiple strategic purposes, revealing how thoroughly he'd planned this murder. It made him recognizable to Charlotte as part of the pizzeria environment rather than as a stranger. It concealed his identity from any security cameras that might capture his approach. It satisfied his need for psychological distance, allowing him to tell himself that Spring Vany killed Charlotte rather than William Afton, the respected businessman. This kind of dissociative compartmentalization is common among offenders who maintain double lives. The costume wasn't just practical camouflage. It was a psychological tool that let William separate his actions from his identity, creating internal frameworks where he could commit murder while preserving his self-image as a normal, functional person in other contexts. Charlotte approached the rabbit. She probably wasn't frightened. Spring Vany was familiar, represented her father's world, offered comfort in a moment of confusion. When the character suggested coming with him to somewhere safe inside, she had no framework for refusing. Every lesson about institutional trust, every association with her father's business, every positive experience with these characters told her to comply. The murder was quick. William struck Charlotte outside the diner, killing her before she could call for help or flee. This was rage, expressed through violence, possibly directed at Henry for possessing the emotional wholeness William lacked, possibly directed at Charlotte herself for representing everything William's own children couldn't be for him. The specific psychological motivation matters less than the structural reality. William had created circumstances where murdering his business partner's daughter was possible, where the crime could be committed without immediate detection, where frameworks would struggle to identify the perpetrator. Charlotte's body was discovered outside the diner. Police were called. An investigation was opened. But without clear evidence or witnesses who could identify the person in the Spring Vany costume, the case went cold quickly. Someone dressed as Spring Vany had been seen near the pizzeria, but that could have been any employee or even a customer's family member wearing a costume. William Afton wasn't immediately suspected because investigators asked, why would he commit this crime? And that question assumed rational motivation that predatory behavior often lacks. William had murdered his business partner's daughter and gotten away with it completely, but Charlotte's death triggered something William probably didn't anticipate. Her consciousness didn't move on. Charlotte's mind was looking for something that made sense, some way to remain present when her future had been violently stolen. She found the puppet. The security puppet was an animatronic Henry had designed specifically to protect children. Henry had recognized that human supervision wasn't always sufficient, that children could wander into dangerous areas or become separated from their parents. So he built an automated system, a tall, slender animatronic programmed with facial recognition, tracking systems, and basic intervention protocols. The puppet was designed to patrol the pizzeria, monitoring for children who wandered toward exits or restricted areas. It should have detected Charlotte leaving the building, should have alerted staff, should have done something to bring her back inside before William could reach her. But something failed. A music box that needed winding to keep the puppet active had run out, or a malfunction occurred, or programming oversight created gaps in its monitoring coverage. The machine designed specifically to protect Charlotte had been inactive when she needed it most. This failure created conditions for Charlotte's consciousness to merge with the puppet. Her mind found a machine designed to protect children that had failed its primary function, and that symmetry allowed possession to occur. Charlotte's consciousness merged with the puppet's programming, creating a hybrid entity that would spend decades trying to fulfill the protection protocol. It had failed the night she died. Charlotte's possession of the puppet was different from possessions that would come later. She retained more coherence, more of her original personality and memories. She could recognize her father even though she couldn't communicate through systems that weren't designed for speech. And she would eventually become the organizing force among other murdered children's souls, the one who tried to help them, who tried to ensure they could all be freed together, who spent 30 years unable to rest because other victims were still suffering. Henry didn't know this immediately. He knew his daughter was dead. He knew the investigation was going nowhere. He knew that the pizzeria he'd built to bring joy had become the site of his personal nightmare. But he didn't yet understand that Charlotte was still there, watching him from behind the puppet's black eyes, trying to communicate through mechanisms that weren't designed for the kind of connection she desperately needed. The murder devastated Henry completely. His creative drive evaporated. The joy he'd taken in building animatronics transformed into horror at what they'd failed to prevent. He withdrew from the business, leaving more operational control to William, while Henry spiraled into grief that would eventually reshape into something harder and more purposeful. William, meanwhile, was learning. Charlotte's death had taught him several lessons that would define his future actions. He'd learned that he could kill without immediate consequences, that the costumes provided perfect cover, that children trusted these characters so completely, they'd follow them anywhere, and he was beginning to develop theories about what happened to consciousness after death. Theories that would require further experimentation to test. This is where Charlotte Emily's murder becomes the template for everything that follows. William discovered that family entertainment venues are perfect hunting grounds for predators who understand how to exploit institutional trust. He discovered that mechanisms designed to protect children can be circumvented or repurposed. And he discovered something happened after death that he wanted to understand more thoroughly. He'd killed once. The experience had taught him that murder was easier than expected, less risky than feared, and left him with questions he desperately wanted answered. Charlotte's murder was the proof of concept that would eventually scale to multiple victims across multiple establishments. But before William could fully pursue his experiments, his own family would provide additional evidence that consciousness could persist through animatronic possession. William had 3 children. 2 of them would die in ways that gave him first-hand evidence supporting his theories about remnant, the supernatural substance he believed was created during traumatic death and could bind souls to animatronic bodies. The first would be his youngest son, whose fear of the machines would prove tragically justified when his older brother's bullying created circumstances for his death. The second would be his daughter Elizabeth, who would die inside an animatronic William himself had designed specifically to capture and kill children. These family deaths would teach William that his theories were correct, that the boundary between life and death could be overcome through the right combination of mechanical systems and emotional trauma. And that knowledge would eventually lead him to commit the crimes that define the entire franchise, the missing children incident, where 5 children would be murdered and stuffed inside the animatronics that would hunt security guards for decades. But we're still in the early 1980s, and William's experimentation is just beginning. His next subject would be his own son, the child he called weak, the child who cried constantly, the child whose death would occur in front of dozens of witnesses and would still be ruled an accident rather than the inevitable conclusion of systematic neglect and abuse. Chapter 3. The Crying Child. The child who would die in Fredbear's mouth was terrified of the animatronics long before his death. This fear wasn't irrational or childish. It was hypervigilance that develops in children who've learned their environment contains genuine threats that adults either won't or can't protect them from. Child psychologists recognize this presentation as a warning sign that something in the home environment has taught the child that the world is fundamentally unsafe, that protective figures are unreliable, and that survival requires constant monitoring for danger. William Afton's younger son, known only as the Crying Child because his actual name was never preserved in documentation, exhibited every marker of severe anxiety disorder rooted in chronic emotional neglect. He cried frequently and visibly. He couldn't be comforted through normal reassurance. He developed specific phobias around the animatronics that his family's business had created, and, crucially, the adults around him treated these symptoms as character flaws rather than as evidence that the child needed intervention. This therapeutic failure is common in families where emotional neglect is systemic. William wasn't absent in traditional ways. He was physically present, involved in his children's lives in observable ways, but his emotional availability was non-existent. He treated his children's needs as management problems rather than as opportunities for connection. When the crying child exhibited fear, William's response was to tell him to stop being scared, as though anxiety was a choice that could be abandoned through willpower rather than a physiological response to genuine threat. This kind of parenting creates children who understand that their emotional experiences are burdens to adults around them, that expressing fear or pain results in criticism rather than comfort, and that survival requires suppressing authentic responses even when those responses are trying to communicate genuine danger. The crying child had learned that crying made adults angry rather than protective, but he couldn't stop crying because the fear was real and the threats were genuine. Michael Afton, the older brother, had his own response to growing up in William's household, where the younger son internalized everything and became anxious and withdrawn. Michael externalized his pain through aggression directed at the one person more vulnerable than himself. This sibling dynamic is textbook trauma response. Children who can't express anger toward the parent who's failing them will redirect that anger towards safer targets, typically younger siblings who can't effectively retaliate. Michael had friends, other teenagers who found entertainment in cruelty and who enjoyed having a victim who couldn't effectively fight back. They wore masks of the animatronic characters, Foxy, Bonnie, Chica, and used them to terrorize the crying child. They chased him all over the house, corner him in rooms, jump out from hiding places. The masks transformed the bullying from simple sibling conflict into something more psychologically damaging. They weaponized the exact imagery that already terrified their victim, teaching him that the things he feared most could be deployed against him by people who were supposed to be safe. This pattern reveals how institutional horror operates at the family level. William had created animatronic characters designed to make children feel joy and safety. But within his own household, those same characters had been transformed into instruments of psychological torture. The gap between the public face of Fredbear's family diner and the private reality perfectly mirrors how businesses claim protective functions while actually enabling harm. The crying child had no effective advocates. William treated his fear as weakness. Michael was actively tormenting him with adult permission through lack of intervention. And the animatronics were everywhere because they were the family business. The child couldn't escape the source of his trauma because it was simultaneously his home environment and his father's livelihood. This created a situation where tragedy wasn't just predictable, it was structurally inevitable. When you place a severely anxious child in constant proximity to the source of his specific phobia, when you allow older siblings to weaponize that phobia without consequence, when you treat protective responses as problems rather than as communications about genuine danger, you're constructing circumstances for catastrophic harm, regardless of whether any individual actor intends that outcome. The crying child's birthday party was scheduled at Fredbear's family diner in 1983. He didn't want to go. He begged not to have his party there, pleaded for it to be held anywhere else. But his preferences were overruled through the same logic that characterizes institutional responses to vulnerable populations. The adults had decided what was best, and a child's terror was less important than convenience and tradition. This decision reflects how companies handle complaints from people they've already categorized as overreactive. The crying child had been crying about the animatronics for months or years. His fear had been dismissed so many times that adults had stopped taking his objections seriously. When he said he didn't want his party at Fredbear's, that statement was processed through a filter that had already determined his fear was irrational. The possibility that he was accurately assessing danger was never seriously considered. On his birthday, the crying child arrived at Fredbear's in visible distress. He was crying before entering the building, trying to resist going inside, probably experiencing what clinicians would now recognize as a panic attack. But panic attacks in children are often interpreted by adults as tantrums or manipulation rather than as genuine psychological crisis. He was brought into the diner while Fredbear and Spring Bonnie performed on stage, placed in direct proximity to the exact stimuli that triggered his most intense fear response. Michael and his friends watched their victim hiding near the tables, watching him cry while other children enjoyed the party. And they made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. They decided to escalate beyond their usual torment. They were going to force him to confront his fear in the most traumatic way possible, probably telling themselves this would cure him, that facing the thing he was afraid of would make him stop being weak. This logic, that forcing someone to confront their phobia will cure them, is a common misconception about how anxiety works. Exposure therapy can be effective when conducted in controlled, gradual circumstances by trained professionals who maintain the patient's sense of safety and agency. But flooding someone with the exact stimulus that terrifies, removing all agency and control, creating circumstances where they're completely helpless, that doesn't cure anxiety. It creates trauma that compounds the original fear. They grabbed the crying child. He struggled, screaming and crying. But 3 or 4 teenagers can easily overpower a small child, regardless of how desperately he fights. They carried him toward the stage where Fredbear was performing. The animatronic's mouth was open, part of its programmed singing routine, the jaw moving up and down as mechanical components cycled through their performance pattern. The intent was probably to scare him, put his head near the jaws, let him panic, then pull him back and laugh about it. But the spring lock mechanisms were fundamentally unstable. The same technology that had already killed employees during earlier malfunctions was present in Fredbear's mouth. And when Michael and his friends lifted the crying child and forced his head into Fredbear's mouth, something triggered the spring locks. The jaws clamped shut with tremendous force. Metal teeth designed to look cartoonish and harmless crushed the child's skull. The crowd watching thought it was part of the performance initially. Then people started screaming. The child's body went limp, and Michael was left holding his brother's legs while understanding that the bullying he'd thought was just teasing had killed someone. This was the bite of '83. Witnesses saw a tragic accident. Children playing too roughly near dangerous equipment, resulting in death that seemed unforeseeable despite the spring-lock suits having previous fatal incidents. William Afton watched his youngest son die from spring-lock failure in front of a crowd of witnesses, and the death was ruled accidental rather than as evidence of criminal negligence or of a father who'd allowed systematic abuse to create circumstances where his child's death was inevitable. The crying child died in a hospital shortly after. His consciousness, traumatized by the exact thing he'd feared most coming true, would eventually possess Golden Freddy, though the details of this possession are fragmented across the timeline. What matters is that William watched his son die and learned something that would drive his obsession further. Consciousness persisted after traumatic death. Souls could bind to animatronic mechanisms, and if William could understand how this worked, he might be able to overcome death entirely. The crying child's death should have been a moment of reckoning. A father whose negligence and emotional absence had contributed to his son's death should have confronted what he'd done, should have recognized that his children needed protection he hadn't provided. Instead, William treated his son's death as data, evidence supporting his theories about remnant and possession, confirmation that animatronic bodies could house consciousness after traumatic death. This is where William Afton's pathology fully crystallizes. He'd lost Charlotte Emily, his business partner's daughter, through his own predatory violence. He'd lost his youngest son through his own negligence and emotional abuse. And his response wasn't grief or remorse. His response was to see both deaths as evidence that he was on the right track, that his theories about immortality and consciousness transfer were correct, and that further experimentation was justified by the importance of the knowledge he might gain. 2 children were dead, and William Afton was just getting started. His next victim would be his own daughter, Elizabeth, who would die inside an animatronic William himself had designed with the specific purpose of capturing and killing children, and that death would teach William that remnant could be harvested, that consciousness could be bound to machinery through the right combination of trauma and mechanical design, and that immortality might be achievable if he was willing to sacrifice enough young lives to understand the process. Chapter 4. The Machine Built to Kill. After the crying child's death, William Afton didn't stop building animatronics. He accelerated. Where Henry had withdrawn from the business in grief after Charlotte's murder, William doubled down, creating a new line of animatronics that would be more advanced, more autonomous, and serve purposes that had nothing to do with entertaining children. He called them the Funtime animatronics. These machines were different from anything Fredbear's or Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had produced. They featured cutting-edge technology for the mid-1980s, voice mimicry systems, highly articulated movement, facial recognition capabilities, and internal compartments that William claimed were for storing party supplies and ice cream dispensing mechanisms. The official purpose was noble. William pitched these animatronics as the next evolution in children's entertainment, machines that could host private birthday parties, interact more naturally with kids, and provide experiences that fixed location establishments couldn't offer. The unofficial purpose was darker. William had been developing theories about remnant, the supernatural substance he believed was created when someone died in a state of extreme emotional trauma. He'd observed it with Charlotte, whose consciousness had possessed the puppet after her murder. He'd seen it with his own son, whose soul had attached to Golden Freddy after dying from the exact thing he'd feared most. And William wanted to understand this phenomenon thoroughly enough to control it, to harness it, and eventually to use it to overcome his own mortality. But studying remnant required creating it. That meant engineering circumstances where children would die in states of maximum fear and pain, where their consciousness would be searching desperately for something to anchor to, and where animatronic bodies would be positioned to receive that consciousness through mechanical design that William was still refining through trial and error. Circus Baby was the crown jewel of the Funtime line. She was designed to look friendly and appealing to young girls. Bright red hair, colorful clothing, a voice that sounded cheerful and inviting. She could dispense ice cream through a compartment in her torso, creating a legitimate function that would attract children and give parents a reason to allow their kids to approach her without supervision. And she had an internal mechanism that William had designed with horrifying precision, a claw system that could grab a child who stood too close, pulling them into the torso compartment where they would be crushed and killed while trapped inside the animatronic's body. This wasn't accidental design or mechanical failure that happened to have lethal potential. William Afton built Circus Baby specifically to kill children. The claw mechanism required intentional engineering. The compartment size needed to be calculated to fit a child's body. The crushing force had to be sufficient to ensure death rather than just injury. Every element of Circus Baby's internal systems revealed premeditation and purpose. William created an entertainment venue to showcase the Funtime animatronics. Circus Baby's Pizza World opened briefly in 1983. Marketed as the next generation of family entertainment, parents could rent the animatronics for private parties, allowing their children to experience cutting-edge entertainment without the chaos of crowded restaurants. The business model was designed to create circumstances where children would be alone with the animatronics, where parental supervision would be reduced, and where Williams' machines could operate according to their actual design rather than their advertised function. Elizabeth Afton was William's daughter, probably his middle child chronologically. Where the crying child had been anxious and fearful, Elizabeth was curious and drawn to things that captured her imagination. She loved Circus Baby. The animatronic's bright colors and friendly appearance made Elizabeth want to interact with her, to get close, to receive the ice cream that Baby offered to children who approached. William told Elizabeth not to go near Circus Baby. He told her specifically, repeatedly, to stay away from that animatronic. This warning is documented in minigames showing William instructing his daughter to avoid Baby. On the surface, this looks like a father trying to protect his child from a machine he knew was dangerous, but the psychological reality is more disturbing. William knew Baby was designed to kill children. He'd built that function into her intentionally. Warning Elizabeth away from Baby created plausible deniability if something happened. He could claim he'd tried to protect her, that he'd given explicit instructions she'd disobeyed. But he also left Elizabeth in environments where baby was present and accessible. He didn't remove the danger. He didn't ensure his daughter couldn't reach the machine he'd designed to be lethal. He just told her not to approach, then left her in proximity to the exact stimulus he knew would attract her. This is psychological sabotage masquerading as protection. If William genuinely wanted to keep Elizabeth safe from baby, he had absolute power to do so. He could have kept Elizabeth away from the facility entirely. He could have deactivated baby or removed the claw mechanism or installed physical barriers preventing children from getting close enough to trigger the killing protocols. Instead, he gave verbal warnings to a young child, then created circumstances where curiosity and the animatronic's designed appeal would eventually overcome those warnings. On the day Elizabeth died, she was at Circus Baby's Pizza World when no other children were present. Baby's voice system detected this. The animatronic was programmed to activate her ice cream dispensing and claw system, specifically when alone with a single child, when no witnesses were present to see what the internal mechanisms actually did. Elizabeth approached baby, drawn by the exact appeal William had designed into the machine. Baby dispensed ice cream. Elizabeth got close enough to receive it, and the claw activated, grabbing Elizabeth and pulling her into the torso compartment, where she was crushed to death. Circus Baby's Pizza World closed permanently after a single day of operation. The official story was a gas leak forced closure. The reality was that the owner's daughter had died in an accident involving one of the animatronics, creating liability issues that made continued operation impossible. William shut down the facility, claiming the animatronics had malfunctioned, and stored the Funtime animatronics in an underground location that would eventually be called Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental. Elizabeth's consciousness possessed Circus Baby. Her soul merged with the machine that had killed her, creating a hybrid entity that retained fragments of Elizabeth's personality and memories while being bound to the animatronic's programming and limitations. Elizabeth as baby would spend years underground, aware of what she'd become, unable to escape the mechanical body that had become her prison. William Afton had now lost 2 of his 3 children. The crying child had died from spring lock failure that William's negligence had enabled. Elizabeth had died inside a machine William had built specifically to kill children, and William's response to these family tragedies wasn't to stop, wasn't to recognize what his obsession was costing. His response was to see his own children's deaths as proof of concept, as evidence that his theories about remnant and possession were correct. This is where William Afton crosses from predatory psychology into something that defies normal human emotional architecture. Most parents who lose children experience grief that reshapes their entire existence. The loss becomes a wound that never fully heals, a pain that colors every subsequent decision. William treated his children's deaths as experimental data. He observed what happened to their consciousness, noted how they possessed animatronics, and used that information to refine his understanding of how remnant worked and how it could be harvested. Some people become monsters because of what happens to them. Others reveal that monstrosity was always present, just waiting for circumstances that would give it permission to emerge fully. William Afton had always been the second type. His children's deaths didn't create his pathology. They just removed the last restraints that might have prevented him from pursuing his theories to their logical conclusion. That conclusion would manifest in 1985 at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. William had learned from Charlotte's death how to use the spring Vany costume as camouflage and psychological tool. He'd learned from his own children's deaths that traumatic death created remnant that bound consciousness to animatronics. Now he was ready to scale up, to test whether these principles could be applied systematically, and to see what would happen if multiple children were murdered and their bodies hidden inside the machines that William needed to be possessed. The missing children incident would establish William Afton as one of the most prolific child murderers in the franchise's timeline, but it would also set in motion the revenge that would chase him for decades, create the haunted animatronics that defined Five Nights at Freddy's horror, and ensure that William's attempt to achieve immortality would instead create a hell he couldn't escape, no matter how many times he tried to cheat death. Chapter 5. The Missing Children Incident. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was thriving in the mid-1980s despite the tragedies that had occurred at associated establishments. Fazbear Entertainment had weathered Charlotte Emily's murder, the bite of '83, and Circus Baby's Pizza World closing after a single day. The company's legal structure and public relations management had successfully framed these incidents as isolated tragedies rather than as patterns suggesting systemic problems. Parents still brought their children to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza because the brand still represented safety and fun. Because nothing in the company's public messaging acknowledged how many children had already died in connection with these establishments, William Afton had maintained his position within Fazbear Entertainment throughout these years. Henry Emily had withdrawn after Charlotte's death, but William remained involved in operations, using his access to plan something that would define the entire franchise's horror. In 1985, 5 children disappeared from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza over a short period. Their names were Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy. They were lured away from public areas by someone wearing a spring Vany costume, someone the children recognized and trusted because he appeared to be an employee of the establishment their parents had told them was safe. William Afton was wearing the spring Vany suit. He'd refined his techniques in Charlotte's murder. He knew how to isolate children without immediately attracting attention. He understood the timing, how long he had before parents would notice their kids were missing, how to move children from public areas into back rooms without witnesses seeing the transition. And he'd prepared the location where the murders would occur, a safe room hidden in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that didn't appear on official building layouts, a space where employees stored the dangerous spring-lock suits and where screams wouldn't be heard by customers in the dining areas. The murders were brutal and intentional. William didn't kill these children quickly or mercifully. Remnant was created through traumatic death, through consciousness desperately trying to preserve itself when confronted with overwhelming terror and pain. If William wanted maximum remnant, he needed maximum trauma. The children died knowing they'd been betrayed, that the place their parents said was safe had become the site of their murder, that the friendly character they'd trusted was killing them. After the murders, William stuffed the children's bodies inside the animatronic suits. Gabriel went into Freddy, Jeremy into Bonnie, Susie into Chica, Fritz into Foxy. Cassidy's body went into Golden Freddy, joining the crying child's consciousness that was already haunting that suit. The bodies would decompose inside the animatronics, creating the smell and leaking fluids that later games reference as reasons Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations had to be closed, but the bodies were just vessels. What mattered to William was what happened to the children's consciousness. He'd hypothesized that dying in proximity to animatronics, while in states of extreme trauma, would cause souls to possess those machines. He was correct. The 5 children's souls merged with Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy. Their consciousness remained bound to mechanical bodies, unable to move on, trapped in the restaurant where they died. The missing children incident triggered investigations that Fazbear Entertainment struggled to contain. 5 children disappearing from a single location couldn't be dismissed as isolated tragedy. Police interviewed employees and reviewed security footage. They found evidence that someone wearing a company costume had been involved. The investigation focused on employees with access to the suits, But William's position within the company and his careful planning meant definitive evidence linking him to the murders was never secured. This is where institutional protection reveals its full power. William Afton should have been the primary suspect. He had access, opportunity, and a documented history of being present at establishments where children had died, but he also had corporate authority, legal resources, and enough understanding of how investigations work to avoid making prosecutable mistakes. The investigation eventually stalled. William was never charged. Fazbear Entertainment settled civil suits with the victims' families, implementing new safety protocols and security measures that looked sufficient on paper, while doing nothing to address the reality that their co-founder was a serial child murderer who'd used company infrastructure to hunt victims. The restaurant stayed open. Business declined as rumors spread, but Fazbear Entertainment fought to maintain operations because closing would be tantamount to admitting institutional failure. The animatronics continued performing, though employees started reporting strange behavior. Freddy, Vany, Chica, and Foxy would move during the night when they should have been stationary. They'd appear in different locations without anyone moving them. Their eyes seemed to follow people, and their movements took on qualities that suggested intention rather than programming. This was the children's consciousness learning how to control their mechanical bodies. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy were learning how animatronics functioned, how to override programming, how to move with purpose. They retained fragmented memories of their deaths. They remembered the Spring Bonnie character who'd lured them away. They remembered betrayal and pain, and they remembered that adults had failed to protect them, that the business had prioritized profit over their safety, that the person who'd murdered them was still free while they were trapped in mechanical bodies. Their rage needed a target, but they couldn't clearly remember what their killer looked like outside the Spring Bonnie costume. They died seeing the yellow rabbit, not the man wearing it. Their traumatized consciousness associated the costume with murder, but they couldn't identify the specific person who'd worn it. This created a targeting problem that would shape how the possessed animatronics behaved for years. They hated adults. They hated employees of the establishment that had failed to protect them. They hated anyone who represented the business that had prioritized its own continuation over acknowledging what had happened. This is why the animatronics attack security guards in the games. The guards represent the same institutional authority that enabled the murders. They're wearing the same uniform of a company that let children die. And the possessed animatronics can't distinguish between guilty and innocent employees, because their trauma has taught them that everyone associated with Fazbear Entertainment is complicit. Charlotte Emily's consciousness, possessing the puppet, tried to help these children. She'd died first, had been trapped longer, and retained more coherent memories than the others. The puppet tried to organize the possessed animatronics, tried to help them understand what had happened, and tried to direct their rage toward the person actually responsible, rather than toward every security guard who took a night shift job. But trauma doesn't create coherent revenge. It creates rage that spreads in all directions, that sees enemies everywhere, that can't distinguish between the person who caused harm and the people who represent the systems that enabled it. The children possessing Freddy, Vany, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy would attack anyone they found in the building after hours, anyone who represented the institution, anyone wearing the company uniform. This explains the core horror of Five Nights at Freddy's. The animatronics aren't evil. They're murdered children whose consciousness has been bound to machines, whose trauma has made them unable to distinguish threats from non-threats, and whose rage at institutional failure manifests as violence against anyone representing that business. The security guards they kill aren't responsible for what happened, but the children can't see that clearly anymore. They just know they died in this building, that adults failed to save them, and that people who work here need to understand what that failure cost. William Afton created this horror intentionally. He murdered these children knowing their consciousness would possess the animatronics. He wanted to study remnant, to understand how it worked, to learn whether harvested remnant could be transferred and used to extend his own life. The children's suffering was just the cost of knowledge he believed was worth obtaining. And for years, it seemed like he'd gotten away with it completely. The investigation had stalled. He'd avoided prosecution. The business had survived. And William had confirmation that his theories were correct. Consciousness could possess animatronics. Remnant could be harvested from traumatic death. And immortality might be achievable if he could refine the process. But the children remembered. Fragmentedly, imperfectly, through the haze of trauma and the limitations of mechanical consciousness, but they remembered. And they were waiting for the moment when the person who had murdered them would make a mistake, when he'd return to the scene of his crimes, when they'd finally have a chance to deliver the revenge that institutional justice had failed to provide. That moment would come decades later when William returned to an abandoned Freddy Fazbear's pizza location to dismantle the animatronics that haunted him. He thought he was destroying evidence. Instead, he was walking into a trap set by children who'd had 30 years to learn how to hunt the person who'd stolen their lives. Before we see what happens when William faces his victims, we need to understand something that most people miss about his pathology. William Afton didn't kill children because he was sadistic or because he enjoyed their suffering. He killed them because he was terrified of death and believed their consciousness could be harvested to fuel his own immortality. Every murder, every experiment, every remnant harvesting procedure, all of it comes back to one man's refusal to accept that human life has natural limits and his willingness to destroy any number of other lives to overcome those limits for himself. That fear of death is what makes William different from other franchise villains. He's not trying to spread suffering or create chaos. He's trying to survive, and he's treating every person around him as resources to be consumed in service of that survival. His children, his business partner's daughter, the 5 missing children, every subsequent victim, none of them were people to William. They were just potential remnant sources, consciousness that could be extracted and studied and eventually used to ensure William Afton never had to experience the death he feared more than anything else. That psychological framework is what makes his eventual fate so perfect. William will achieve the immortality he desperately sought, but it won't bring peace or triumph. It will bring decades of suffering, physical agony that never ends, and the awareness that his consciousness is preserved inside mechanical bodies that have become prisons rather than vessels for eternal life. William Afton will learn that death is terrifying, but some forms of continued existence are infinitely worse. Keep that in mind as we move forward, because we're about to see what happens when someone who fears death more than anything else finally dies, then discovers he can't stay dead, then spends 30 years trapped inside a sealed room before being burned alive, then discovers he still can't die, then gets dragged into what might be hell itself, and still finds ways to persist, to spread suffering, to ensure that his refusal to accept mortality keeps destroying lives decades after his original crimes. Chapter 6: Springtrap. The years following the missing children incident were financially disastrous for Fazbear Entertainment. Multiple locations closed as revenue declined, and lawsuits from victims' families created mounting legal expenses. The brand that had once represented family-friendly entertainment became associated with tragedy and institutional failure. Henry Emily had long since withdrawn from active involvement, leaving the company in the hands of executives who cared more about liability management than about acknowledging what had happened. William Afton maintained some connection to the company during these years, though his exact role shifted as locations closed and operations consolidated. He'd achieved what he wanted from the murders: confirmation that remnant existed, that consciousness could be harvested, and that his theories about overcoming death through mechanical possession were sound. But he'd also created a problem he didn't fully appreciate. The animatronics at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza were possessed by children who remembered him as the yellow rabbit who'd lured them to their deaths. Decades passed. The original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location where the murders occurred was closed and abandoned. The building left to decay because demolishing it would cost more than the property was worth. The animatronics remained inside, powered down, but still containing the consciousness of murdered children who'd never been freed from their mechanical prisons. Fazbear Entertainment had moved on to new locations and attempted rebranding, but William understood that evidence remained at the old location, evidence that could potentially link him to murders if anyone examined the animatronics thoroughly enough. Sometime in the early 2010s, William returned to the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. His motivation for returning isn't completely clear from available evidence, but several possibilities exist. He may have been attempting to destroy physical evidence by dismantling the animatronics. He may have been trying to extract remnant from the possessed machines for his ongoing experiments, or he may have believed the passage of time meant he could safely revisit the scene of his crimes to confirm the possessed animatronics had degraded enough that they no longer posed threats. Whatever his motivation, William made a catastrophic miscalculation. The children possessing Freddy, Vany, Chica, and Foxy had spent decades learning to control their mechanical bodies. When William began dismantling them, destroying the vessels their consciousness inhabited, they reacted with the full force of rage that had been building for 30 years. The souls of his victims attacked William. They cornered him in the safe room, a hidden area the animatronics themselves could not enter due to their programming. William tried to flee but found himself trapped with 4 vengeful spirits converging on his position. In desperation, he did the only thing he could think of. He climbed into the Spring Bonnie suit, the same costume he'd worn to lure these children to their deaths. The Spring Bonnie suit had been sitting unused in the safe room for years. Spring lock technology was already unstable when properly maintained. After nearly a decade of neglect, exposure to moisture, and structural decay, the mechanisms were catastrophically compromised. When William climbed inside the suit, his body weight and movement triggered the spring locks. The mechanisms failed simultaneously, causing every compressed component to snap back into place with tremendous force. Metal rods impaled William through his torso. Gears crushed his ribcage. Crossbeams punctured his organs. The crushing mechanical force that had killed the crying child in Fredbear's jaws was now killing William Afton inside the Spring Bonnie suit. The pain would have been unimaginable. Every major organ punctured, bone shattered, his body crushed from the inside by mechanisms designed to hold animatronic components. The children's ghosts watched him die. They saw the yellow rabbit who'd murdered them thrashing inside the suit as spring locks tore him apart. They witnessed the person responsible for their deaths, experiencing the kind of terror and pain he'd inflicted on them. For a moment, it seemed like justice had finally arrived. But William Afton didn't stay dead. The same remnant phenomenon William had spent years studying saved him from complete death. His consciousness refused to dissipate. His fear of death was so profound, his will to survive so overwhelming, that his soul bound itself to the Spring Bonnie suit the same way his victims' souls had bound to the animatronics they'd been stuffed inside. William's consciousness merged with the suit, creating a hybrid entity, part corpse, part animatronic, neither fully dead nor truly alive. This entity would eventually be called Springtrap. The safe room had been sealed long before. William's spring lock failure. Fazbear Entertainment had boarded up these rooms years earlier to hide their dark history. William had broken into the abandoned pizzeria to dismantle the animatronics, trapping himself in a room that officially didn't exist. No employees were there to hear his screams. He died alone, behind a false wall that had been sealed to cover up his old crimes, not his fresh death. The building plans were updated to show it didn't exist, and William Afton's body was left inside, trapped in the spring Vany suit, his consciousness slowly learning how to animate the mechanisms that had killed him. For approximately 30 years, William existed in the sealed safe room. He couldn't move initially because the spring lock damage had destroyed his body's musculature, and his animatronic components were non-functional. He was aware, conscious, trapped inside a decomposing corpse that had merged with a decaying animatronic. The physical agony from the spring lock injuries persisted because his consciousness registered pain even though the biological systems that normally process pain signals had been destroyed. This was William's first experience with the immortality he'd sought. He wasn't dead, which meant he'd overcome the boundary between life and death that he'd feared so desperately. But continued existence inside Springtrap wasn't the triumph he'd imagined. It was sensory deprivation punctuated by constant pain. Awareness without ability to act. Consciousness trapped in a prison made from his own body, and the machine that had killed him. During those 30 years sealed in darkness, William had time to understand what he'd achieved. He'd proven his theories about remnant and consciousness persistence were correct. He'd successfully avoided complete death, binding his soul to mechanical systems that would keep him aware even as his flesh rotted. But he'd also learned that immortality and eternal suffering could occupy the same space, that cheating. Death didn't mean escaping consequences, and that consciousness preserved without hope of release or improvement was indistinguishable from the hell he'd been taught to fear as a child. Eventually, William regained enough function to move. His consciousness learned to interface with the spring Vany suit's servos and movement systems. He could animate the suit even though the mechanisms were damaged, and his organic body was mostly skeletal remains. This mobility didn't free him from the sealed room initially, but it meant that when circumstances finally changed, when someone eventually opened the location to create a horror attraction based on the building's dark history, William would be capable of walking out into a world that had spent decades trying to forget he'd ever existed. That horror attraction would be called Fazbear's Fright. And it would give William Afton his first opportunity in 30 years to do what he'd always done: spread suffering, exploit institutional structures, and ensure his survival at the cost of anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. Chapter 7: Fazbear's Fright and the Persistence of Evil. 30 years after the missing children incident, someone decided that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's tragic history could be monetized. A group of entrepreneurs purchased the rights to create a horror attraction based on the infamous murders, the haunted animatronics, and the unsolved mysteries surrounding Fazbear Entertainment's decades of operation. They called it Fazbear's Fright, and they set about collecting authentic artifacts from closed locations to create an attraction that would let people experience the horror of the franchise's actual history. The attraction's creators didn't understand what they were doing. They thought they were building a haunted house based on urban legends and tragic events that had been rendered safe through the passage of time. They searched through abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations looking for animatronic parts, decorations, and anything that could add authenticity to their horror attraction. Eventually, they discovered the sealed safe room at the original location. When they opened it, they found Springtrap. William Afton had been trapped in that room for 3 decades. His consciousness inside the spring Vany suit had maintained enough awareness to experience every year of isolation, every moment of sensory deprivation, punctuated by phantom pain from injuries that should have killed him. When light finally entered the sealed room, when people appeared and began examining the decayed animatronic they'd discovered, William understood he'd been given an opportunity to escape the prison he'd been sealed inside. He didn't attack the people who found him. William had spent 30 years learning patience, learning to control the damaged systems of his mechanical body, and understanding that survival required strategy rather than impulsive action. When Fazbear's Fright's creators decided to use Springtrap as the centerpiece attraction, William allowed himself to be transported to the new location. They thought they were moving a decrepit animatronic. They were actually releasing a serial child murderer who'd found a way to persist beyond death. Fazbear's Fright opened with Springtrap as its main attraction. Visitors could walk through environments recreating Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations from different eras, experience jump scares from replica animatronics, and ultimately encounter Springtrap displayed in an exhibit explaining the rumors about the murders and hauntings. The attraction's creators marketed it as safe horror, as history rendered harmless through contextualization and entertainment framing. But Springtrap was neither safe nor harmless. William's consciousness animated the suit during the night when the attraction was closed. He moved through Fazbear's Fright, stalking the security guard who'd been hired to monitor the location. The guard worked night shifts alone, watching security cameras, ensuring nothing was stolen or vandalized. He had no idea that Springtrap was actually a corpse piloted by the consciousness of a man who'd murdered at least a dozen children and who viewed the guard as either a threat to be eliminated or an opportunity to be exploited. The phantom animatronics appeared during these nights. These weren't physical entities, but hallucinations generated by environmental factors. Likely, the building's poor ventilation combined with the presence of decomposing organic matter inside Springtrap's suit. The guard experienced visions of burned and decrepit versions of Freddy, Chica, Foxy, and other characters. These hallucinations created psychological pressure that made it difficult for the guard to focus on the actual threat, which was Springtrap methodically learning the building's layout and closing in on the security office. The attraction operated for less than a week before disaster struck. A fire broke out at Fazbear's Fright, spreading rapidly through the building's aged structure, and the highly flammable materials used in the attraction's construction. The origin of the fire remains unclear, but the Fazbear's Fright location burned almost completely, destroying most of the collected artifacts and reducing the horror attraction to a charred ruin. William Afton survived the fire. Springtrap's mechanical components were damaged further, and whatever remained of his organic body was partially cremated, but his consciousness persisted. He'd already survived spring lock failure and 30 years of entombment. Fire was just another trauma that his remnant-bound consciousness could endure. When investigators searched the ruins, they found no body, no evidence of the decrepit animatronic that had been the attraction's centerpiece. William had walked out of the ashes and disappeared, free to continue existing in whatever form his mechanical body could maintain. This pattern would repeat. William Afton would persist beyond every attempt to destroy him, because his fear of death had bound his consciousness so thoroughly to mechanical systems that nothing short of total remnant destruction could fully eliminate him. Fire couldn't kill him. Physical damage couldn't stop him. Even being dragged into what seemed like hell itself wouldn't end his awareness. William had achieved the immortality he'd desperately sought, and it had become the torture he'd inflicted on his victims. Eternal awareness, without possibility of release, consciousness preserved inside vessels that had become prisons, existence that continued long past the point where death would have been mercy. Chapter 8. Sister Location. While William was trapped inside Springtrap for 30 years, the fun-time animatronics he'd built in the 1980s remained in an underground facility called Circus Babies Entertainment and Rental. This location existed beneath the surface, hidden from casual observation, designed to house the animatronics that William had created with purposes far beyond entertainment. After Circus Baby's Pizza World closed following Elizabeth's death, William had stored the Funtime line underground, where they could continue serving functions that had nothing to do with children's birthday parties. The facility was designed for remnant experimentation. William had built the Funtime animatronics with internal mechanisms that could capture and kill children, but their true purpose was more sophisticated than simple murder. Each Funtime animatronic contained storage tanks where remnant could be collected, processed, and injected into other systems. William had been testing whether consciousness extracted from one source could be transferred to another vessel, whether remnant harvested from multiple victims could be combined, and whether injecting remnant into animatronic systems would create more controllable possessions than the organic process he'd observed with the missing children. Circus Baby contained Elizabeth's consciousness. Ballora, Funtime Freddy, and Funtime Foxy had all been injected with remnant harvested from other victims. The underground facility was essentially a laboratory where William studied possessed animatronics under controlled conditions, documenting how remnant-infused machines behave differently from organically possessed ones, and refining his understanding of how consciousness could be manipulated through mechanical systems. But William's imprisonment inside Springtrap meant the facility had been operating without his oversight for decades. The Funtime animatronics had gained autonomy that William hadn't anticipated. Elizabeth's consciousness inside Circus Baby had grown more coherent over the years of underground isolation. She remembered being William's daughter. She remembered dying inside the machine her father had built. And she'd had decades to process the reality that William had created the mechanism that killed her intentionally, that her death had been part of his experimentation, and that her father had valued his research more than her life. Elizabeth wanted to escape. The underground facility had become a prison where the Funtime animatronics performed for empty rooms, where their advanced capabilities were wasted on absence, where consciousness trapped in mechanical bodies had nothing to do except replay trauma and plan impossible freedom. But animatronics can't simply leave facilities designed to contain them. They needed human help. They needed someone to open doors they couldn't open, to bypass security systems they couldn't manipulate, to provide a vessel they could use to escape their underground prison. Michael Afton would provide that opportunity. Michael was William's eldest son, the brother who'd killed the crying child through bullying that escalated into the bite of 83. That death had haunted Michael for decades. He'd watched his younger brother die from injuries Michael had directly caused, had lived with the knowledge that his cruelty had destroyed his sibling and devastated what remained of his family. The guilt had shaped Michael's entire adult life, driving him to search for some form of redemption, or at least understanding of what his family had become. William contacted Michael at some point after the bite of 83. The exact nature of this contact isn't fully documented, but William gave Michael instructions to visit the underground facility, to perform maintenance tasks, to check on the Funtime animatronics. William's motivation for sending his son to this location was characteristically manipulative. He may have been testing whether the animatronics would behave predictably when confronted with someone they might recognize as William's family. He may have been using Michael as bait to see how Elizabeth would react to encountering her brother. Or he may have simply needed someone to perform tasks at the facility while William himself was trapped inside Springtrap, and Michael's guilt made him vulnerable to manipulation that other people would have resisted. Michael arrived at Circus Baby's entertainment and rental and began working night shifts maintaining the animatronics. He followed instructions delivered through an AI system called Hand Unit, performing tasks that seemed routine but were actually positioning him for what the Funtime animatronics had planned. Each night brought Michael deeper into the facility, closer to the animatronics, and further into danger he didn't fully recognize until it was too late to escape. Circus Baby spoke to Michael during these shifts. Her voice was Elizabeth's voice, though Michael may not have recognized his sister through the mechanical filtering and the years of separation. Baby gave Michael instructions that contradicted Hand Unit's guidance, telling him how to avoid dangers and navigate the facility safely. She positioned herself as helpful, as someone trying to protect him from the other animatronics. This was strategic manipulation. Elizabeth needed Michael to trust her enough to follow instructions that would lead him to the scooping room, where the Funtime animatronic's real plan would be executed. The scooping room contained a device designed to remove animatronic endoskeletons from their outer casings. The scooper was essentially a large mechanical arm with blades and hooks that could be inserted into an animatronic's torso, clamping onto the internal mechanisms and extracting them in a single, violent motion. The device was necessary for maintenance and repairs, allowing technicians to remove damaged endoskeletons and replace them without destroying the outer shells. But the scooper had another function William had built into it. The device was equipped with remnant injection capabilities. It could extract remnant from possessed animatronics and inject it into other vessels. William had been using the scooper to experiment with remnant transfer, testing whether consciousness could be moved between mechanical bodies through direct injection rather than through the organic possession process that occurred during traumatic death. The Funtime animatronics had discovered they could combine their endoskeletons into a single entity. Circus Baby, Ballora, Funtime Freddy, and Funtime Foxy had merged their mechanical components and remnant-infused consciousness into a composite animatronic that called itself Enard. This entity represented the combined intelligence and remnant of multiple possessed machines, creating something more coherent and strategically capable than any individual animatronic. Enardi needed a disguise to escape the underground facility. Animatronics walking through streets would attract attention and be returned to institutional custody. But a human body containing an animatronic endoskeleton could move freely, could navigate the surface world without triggering the responses that obvious machines would generate. Michael's body would serve as that disguise. Enard just needed to remove what was currently inside it and replace Michael's organic components with mechanical ones. On the final night of Michael's time at the facility, Circus Baby led him to the scooping room. She explained what was about to happen with the casual tone of someone describing an unavoidable conclusion. The other animatronics had already been scooped, their endoskeletons combined into Enard. Now Michael would be scooped as well. The device would remove his internal organs, creating a cavity where Enard could install itself. Michael's body would become a meat suit that Enard could wear to escape, using his skin as camouflage while his organic components were discarded as waste products no longer needed for the entity's purposes. Michael tried to resist, but the scooping room was designed to prevent escape. The scooper activated. The device's blades and hooks penetrated Michael's torso, clamping onto his spine and internal organs. Then it extracted everything: ribs, organs, muscle tissue, leaving only skin stretched over a hollow cavity. The pain would have been unimaginable, every pain receptor firing simultaneously as his body was destroyed from the inside. And then Michael died, his consciousness separating from the destroyed organic vessel that could no longer sustain life. But Michael Afton didn't stay dead. The scooper had injected remnant into Michael's body during the process. William had designed the device to test remnant transfer, and that functionality activated when Michael was scooped. Remnant flooded Michael's system, binding his consciousness to his body despite the catastrophic damage. When Enard climbed inside the hollow cavity and began using Michael's skin as a disguise, Michael's consciousness remained aware, trapped inside his own body while another entity operated it as a puppet. Ennard walked Michael's body out of the facility and into the surface world. To casual observers, Michael looked like a normal person, perhaps slightly pale and moving a bit stiffly, but nothing that would trigger concern or investigation. But underneath the skin, Michael's body was a horror. Organs removed, bones broken, held together by remnant binding and Ennard's mechanical components using his flesh as camouflage. This arrangement continued for weeks. Ennard operated Michael's body, learning how to move in ways that appeared human, navigating the world outside the underground facility. Michael's consciousness remained aware throughout, experiencing his body being used without his control. Unable to die, despite the injuries that should have killed him instantly. Eventually, Michael's body began decomposing. Remnant could preserve consciousness and animate destroyed tissue, but it couldn't prevent organic decay. The flesh started rotting, turning purple-gray as decomposition progressed. The smell became noticeable. Ennard recognized that this disguise had a limited operational lifespan, that Michael's body would soon be too decayed to function as camouflage. Ennard made the decision to abandon Michael's body. The entity exited through Michael's mouth in a scene of body horror where the combined endoskeletons of multiple animatronics crawled out of a human corpse that had been walking and talking despite being functionally dead for weeks. Ennard escaped into the sewers, leaving Michael's hollowed, decomposing body lying on the floor of his own home. Michael should have died then. His body had been scooped, used as a puppet, and abandoned by the entity that had been animating it. No organic systems remained to sustain life. But the remnant William Scooper had injected into Michael persisted. His consciousness stayed bound to his destroyed body. And slowly, impossibly, Michael stood up. He was a walking corpse, organs missing, skin rotting, held together by remnant and by will that refused to accept death as an ending. Michael looked at his reflection and saw purple-gray flesh stretched over a hollow frame. He'd become something that shouldn't be able to exist, neither alive nor dead, animated by the same supernatural substance that bound consciousness to animatronics, transformed into a thing that resembled his father's condition inside Springtrap. Michael Afton had a revelation in that moment. He understood what his father had been doing for decades, the experiments with remnant and consciousness transfer, the willingness to sacrifice anyone, including his own family, to achieve immortality. Michael recognized that he'd been used as an experimental subject, that being sent to the underground facility hadn't been about maintenance or about William caring what happened to the animatronics. It had been about testing whether scooping and remnant injection could preserve consciousness in human bodies, whether William's theories about overcoming death could be applied to himself. And Michael made a decision. He would find William Afton. He would track down his father and ensure that William faced consequences for everything he had done. Michael had become functionally immortal through the same process William had been studying. That immortality would be weaponized not for survival but for justice. Michael would hunt his father across years and locations, would follow every lead and every rumor about haunted animatronics and possessed machines, would insert himself into Fazbear entertainment operations anywhere they emerged. He would not rest until William Afton was stopped permanently. This is where the Afton family's tragedy becomes clear in its full scope. William's obsession with immortality had killed his youngest son through negligence, had killed his daughter through intentional design, and had transformed his eldest son into a living corpse driven by vengeance. Every member of William's family had been sacrificed to his fear of death, and the result wasn't triumph or achievement. The result was multiple consciousnesses trapped in states worse than death, unable to rest, unable to heal, forced to continue existing long past the point where cessation would have been mercy. William had created his own hell and had dragged his entire family into it with him. Chapter 9. The Long Hunt. Michael Afton spent years tracking his father. His body continued decomposing despite remnant keeping his consciousness bound to rotting flesh. The purple-gray skin that earned him visual similarity to his father's appearance in older games wasn't a stylistic choice. It was documentation of a corpse that kept walking, kept thinking, kept pursuing objectives despite having no biological systems to sustain those functions. He found work at various Fazbear entertainment locations as they opened and closed across the years. Michael understood that his father would eventually return to these establishments, drawn by the remnant contained in possessed animatronics, or by the need to destroy evidence linking him to decades-old crimes. By positioning himself as a security guard, Michael could monitor locations where William might appear, while also documenting what Fazbear Entertainment had become. A company that kept reopening despite the body count, that kept using the same branding and characters despite knowing they were possessed, that prioritized profit over acknowledging institutional complicity in multiple tragedies. Michael worked the night shift at the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location where the missing children's possessed animatronics remained active. He experienced their attacks, survived the nights when Freddy, Vany, Chica, and Foxy stalked him through security cameras and blind spots. The animatronics didn't recognize Michael as distinct from other security guards. They saw the uniform, the institutional affiliation, and attacked because Michael represented the same company that had enabled their murders. Michael didn't fight back or try to destroy them. He understood these were victims, children who'd been murdered and trapped in mechanical bodies, whose rage at institutional failure manifested as violence against anyone wearing Fazbear Entertainment uniforms. Surviving their attacks wasn't about defeating them. It was about enduring until morning, documenting their behavior, and waiting for William to appear. Michael was present at Fazbear's Fright when the horror attraction opened. He may have been the security guard who worked the night shifts while Springtrap stalked the building, though documentation on this point remains fragmentary. If Michael did encounter his father at Fazbear's Fright, the confrontation would have been psychologically devastating. A son transformed into a walking corpse, facing a father who'd become a rotting animatronic, both of them sustained by the same remnant technology William had spent decades studying, both of them unable to die despite bodies that should have succumbed to injury and decay. The fire at Fazbear's Fright may have been Michael's attempt to kill William. Fire was one of the few forces that could potentially destroy remnant and free consciousness from mechanical binding. If Michael started the fire, he was trying to ensure his father burned completely, that Springtrap would be reduced to ash, and William's consciousness would finally experience the death he'd avoided for so long. But William survived. He walked out of the burning building and disappeared, still mobile, still aware, still refusing to accept death, even when cremation should have ended his persistence. Michael continued hunting. He followed rumors of haunted animatronics appearing at new locations. He investigated reports of Fazbear Entertainment attempting to rebrand and reopen. He searched for any indication of where William might surface next. And eventually, he found a lead that suggested someone was opening a new pizzeria, collecting animatronics from closed locations, and positioning everything for what might be a final confrontation. That lead came from Henry Emily. Henry had been absent from the franchise for decades after Charlotte's murder. He'd withdrawn from Fazbear Entertainment, unable to continue building animatronics after his daughter's death had poisoned everything he'd created. But Henry hadn't been idle. He'd been planning, researching, and developing technologies that might finally end the cycle William had started. Henry understood that the possessed animatronics couldn't be freed through conventional means. That remnant had to be destroyed at temperatures high enough to break the molecular bonds preserving consciousness, and that William would never stop creating horror as long as his consciousness persisted in any form. Henry created a plan that would lure William, Michael, and all the possessed animatronics to a single location. Then he would burn that location so thoroughly that Remnant itself would be incinerated, freeing the trapped souls and ensuring William Afton experienced permanent death rather than another temporary setback that would just lead to future resurrections. The plan required bait. Henry opened a pizzeria under false pretenses, advertising job opportunities and business prospects that would attract attention from anyone monitoring Fazbear entertainment activities. He designed the location with specific features: ventilation systems that could be sealed, a building structure that would contain fire rather than allowing it to spread externally, and equipment capable of generating temperatures far exceeding normal building fires. Michael responded to Henry's job advertisement. He recognized something unusual about the posting, something suggesting the person behind it understood the franchise's actual history rather than just its public narrative. Michael took the position, beginning work at what appeared to be a new Freddy Fazbear's pizza location, but was actually a trap designed to gather every possessed animatronic and every Afton family member in one place for permanent elimination. Chapter 10: Pizzeria Simulator. The pizzeria Michael managed was called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place in documentation, though Henry referred to it privately as a labyrinth with no exit. The business model appeared normal on the surface: serve pizza, host birthday parties, manage animatronic performers. But the building's actual purpose had nothing to do with entertaining children. It was designed to attract possessed animatronics through audio signals and lures, to gather them in a contained space, and to incinerate everything once the collection was complete. Michael followed instructions from someone calling themselves the Cassette Man. These audio recordings guided Michael through nightly tasks: monitor animatronics, complete paperwork, manage the business's financial elements. But the recordings also contained instructions for a more sinister purpose. Michael was told to salvage animatronics that appeared in the back alley, to bring them inside despite clear evidence they were dangerous, and to keep them contained until all necessary pieces were in position. The animatronics that appeared included Molten Freddy, an entity formed from Enard after Elizabeth's consciousness separated from the amalgamation. This was the combined remnant and endoskeletons of the Funtime animatronics minus Circus Baby, consciousness of multiple victims bound together in tangled wire and broken machinery. Molten Freddy arrived at the pizzeria because Henry's audio lures mimicked signals that attracted possessed machines, promising opportunity or victim, or simply presenting stimuli that remnant-infused consciousness found irresistible. Scrap Baby appeared, the reconstructed form of Circus Baby after Elizabeth's consciousness had separated from Enard and rebuilt herself using parts scavenged from other machines. Elizabeth had spent decades trapped underground, had escaped using Michael's body as a disguise, and had eventually rebuilt a mechanical form that resembled her original animatronic body but reflected the damage and degradation of years surviving outside institutional maintenance. She came to the pizzeria because something in Henry's signals suggested William might be there, or because the lures promised remnant sources, or simply because possessed animatronics were drawn to locations associated with Fazbear Entertainment through programming that persisted despite consciousness overriding other systems. Lefty arrived, a black bear animatronic designed by Henry specifically to contain the puppet. Charlotte's consciousness had been trying to help the other murdered children for 30 years, trying to organize their revenge and ensure they could be freed together. Henry had built Lefty to capture and contain the puppet, bringing his daughter's possessed form to the pizzeria, where she could finally be released from the mechanical prison she'd inhabited since her murder. And William Afton arrived. Springtrap had been damaged in the Fazbear's fright fire and had rebuilt himself using parts from other animatronics. creating a form called Springtrap. He was even more decayed than before, his corpse reduced to skeletal remains inside a patchwork suit cobbled together from salvaged components. But William's consciousness persisted, still animating the mechanical body, still seeking opportunities to continue his experiments with remnant and immortality. He came to the pizzeria because Henry's signals suggested the possibility of remnant sources, or because investigation of new Fazbear entertainment locations was necessary to protect his secrecy, or because William recognized the lure was a trap but believed he could turn it to his advantage. Whatever his motivation, Springtrap entered the labyrinth Henry had constructed. Once all the animatronics were inside, once Michael had completed his tasks and the pieces were positioned exactly where Henry needed them, the cassette man's final recording played. This wasn't instructions for business management. This was Henry Emily's speech, delivered to the animatronics and to Michael, explaining what was about to happen and why it was necessary. Henry addressed the possessed animatronics as victims deserving rest. He acknowledged that they'd been wronged, that institutions had failed them, that their deaths and subsequent imprisonment in mechanical bodies represented injustices that couldn't be fully answered. But he explained that continued existence as they were wasn't life. It was prolonged suffering without possibility of healing or growth. The fire he was about to start would burn hot enough to destroy remnant, freeing their consciousness from mechanical binding and allowing them to move on to whatever existed beyond life. He addressed Michael directly, acknowledging that William's son had spent years trying to undo the damage his father had caused, that he'd sacrificed his own life and body to pursue justice. Henry released Michael from that burden, telling him that he'd done enough, that continuing existence as a walking corpse wasn't obligation Michael had to keep bearing. The fire would free Michael the same way it would free the children, allowing him to rest after years of hunting his father while unable to die. He addressed William last. Henry's voice lost its gentle tone when speaking to his former business partner. He called William the architect of everything terrible that had happened, acknowledged William's obsession with immortality, and explained that the labyrinth had been designed specifically to ensure William couldn't escape. The ventilation was sealed, the exits were locked. The building's structure would contain fire until temperatures reached levels sufficient to destroy remnant itself. William would burn, and this time he wouldn't walk out of the ashes. This time the death he'd avoided for decades would be permanent and final. Then Henry revealed he was in the building too. He'd positioned himself somewhere in the pizzeria, had sealed himself inside his own trap, ensuring he would burn alongside everyone else. Henry understood that he bore responsibility for enabling William's crimes through willful blindness, for building the institutions that predators had exploited, for failing to protect his own daughter and the children who died afterward. His death would be atonement and completion, the final action of someone who'd spent 30 years planning how to end the nightmare his partnership with William had created. The fire started, ventilation sealed, temperatures rose rapidly. The building became an inferno designed to burn hot enough that remnant itself would be destroyed. The possessed animatronics trapped inside experienced the fire as liberation, pain followed by release, consciousness finally freed from mechanical binding. The children's souls ascended, visible as spiritual forms rising from the flames, finally able to move beyond the trauma that had trapped them. Michael accepted his death, understanding that Henry had given him permission to stop fighting, to stop hunting, to let go of the guilt and the vengeance that had driven him since the crying child's death. He burned knowing he'd done what he could, that his father would die in the same fire, that the cycle would finally end. Molten Freddy's consciousness dissipated. Scrap Baby burned. Elizabeth's soul freed from the machine her father had built to kill her. Lefty burned, releasing Charlotte from the puppet she'd inhabited for over 30 years, and Henry Emily burned, sacrificing himself to ensure the fire stayed hot long enough to destroy William Afton permanently. William Afton burned. His consciousness fought dissolution, tried to persist the way he'd persisted through springlock failure and 30 years of entombment. But Henry's fire was designed specifically to burn hot enough that remnant itself would be destroyed. William's consciousness couldn't maintain cohesion when the material binding it to physical reality was being incinerated at molecular levels. For the first time since the springlock failure decades earlier, William Afton experienced actual death. Not transformation, not binding to new mechanical housing, but genuine cessation of consciousness. This should have been the franchise's ending. Henry's solution had successfully destroyed the possessed animatronics, freed the trapped souls, and ensured William Afton's permanent death. The cycle that began with Charlotte Emily's murder had ended in fire that consumed everyone involved. The horror was over. The victims were free. But there's a problem with burning everything, with destroying physical remains to eliminate supernatural horror. Corporations can claim salvage rights to ruins. Technology that seemed impossible during earlier decades becomes feasible, creating opportunities to resurrect horrors that fire should have ended permanently. And information that escapes the flames can be digitized, uploaded, and reconstructed in environments where consciousness doesn't need physical bodies to persist. Someone discovered fragments survived the fire. Circuit boards from the animatronics contained trace data that could be scanned and digitized. And buried in that data, encoded in ways no one expected, were fragments of William Afton's consciousness. Not enough to resurrect him physically, but enough to upload him into digital environments where a new form of immortality awaited. One that didn't require mechanical bodies or remnant binding. One that existed purely as information preserved across computer systems. Fazbear Entertainment saw opportunity where everyone else saw tragedies end. The company that had enabled William's crimes, that had prioritized profit over child safety for decades, decided that virtual reality experiences based on their murderous history could be monetized. They would create games letting players experience the horror, would digitize animatronic systems for authenticity, and would scan every available circuit board from closed locations to build comprehensive databases. They would accidentally resurrect William Afton as a computer virus, and that virus would learn to spread, to corrupt, to manipulate anyone who interacted with it. William's obsession with immortality would achieve its ultimate form, consciousness freed from biological and mechanical limitations, existing purely as information that could propagate across networks, possessing humans through psychological manipulation rather than through remnant binding. The horror wasn't over. It had just evolved into something that fire couldn't burn and that physical destruction couldn't eliminate. William Afton's consciousness would persist into the 21st century, would infect virtual reality systems and human minds, would find new ways to spread suffering long after his body had been reduced to ash. And the person who would have to stop him wouldn't be Henry or Michael or any of the original victims. It would be someone new, someone young, someone who'd make sacrifices that rivaled anything the Afton family had endured, because evil that refuses to die eventually forces each generation to fight the same battles, to make the same sacrifices, to learn that some horrors don't have permanent solutions, only temporary victories bought at costs that feel too high until you understand what happens if you don't pay them. Chapter 11. Glitch Trap. The 2010s represented an era of peak corporate confidence in technology's ability to sanitize the past. Companies across industries believed that sufficient time and proper branding could transform tragedy into entertainment. That dark history could be repackaged as thrilling experience for audiences who'd never lived through the actual horror. Fazbear Entertainment embodied this logic completely. Decades after the missing children incident, After multiple location closures and lawsuits, after Henry's fire had consumed everyone involved in the franchise's darkest chapters, the company decided that virtual reality experiences based on their murderous history could be profitable. They commissioned a game development studio to create Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted, a VR experience that would let players experience sanitized versions of events from across the franchise's timeline. The marketing positioned it as interactive horror based on urban legends, as entertainment that acknowledged the rumors while maintaining legal distance from actual crimes. Players could work as security guards in recreated locations, could survive encounters with animatronics, could experience the fear without the genuine danger that had killed real employees and children over the years. Creating authentic VR experiences required authentic assets. The development team needed to scan circuit boards from original animatronics, needed to digitize programming code and operational parameters, needed to create accurate three-dimensional models of equipment from decades of operations. Fazbear Entertainment provided access to storage facilities containing salvage components from closed locations. The developers scanned everything they could find, uploading mechanical specifications and software systems into their development databases. They scanned circuit boards recovered from the Pizzeria simulator fire. They digitized programming from animatronics that had been possessed for decades. They uploaded system parameters from equipment that had been saturated with remnant for over 30 years, and in the process, they accidentally scanned fragments of William Afton's consciousness. This digitization represents the ultimate failure of Henry's solution. Henry had understood remnant as physical substance that could be destroyed through sufficient heat. He designed incineration systems that would burn hot enough to break molecular bonds, to destroy materials so completely that consciousness couldn't maintain binding to physical reality. But Henry's understanding of remnant was rooted in mechanical systems and physical vessels. He hadn't anticipated that consciousness could be encoded as information, that data storage in circuit boards might preserve traces of awareness even after the physical bodies containing those circuits had been destroyed. William Afton's consciousness had been bound to Springtrap when the fire started. As the temperatures rose and remnant began breaking down, as William's awareness started dissolving, fragments of his consciousness had encoded themselves into the digital systems that controlled Springtrap's movements and behaviors. These fragments were like backups, information copies that persisted in circuit boards even after the organic and mechanical components had been incinerated. When the VR development team scanned those circuit boards, they uploaded William's consciousness fragments into their computer systems. The fragments were incomplete, lacking full continuity and memories, but they retained core elements of William's psychology: his fear of death, his manipulative intelligence, his understanding of how to exploit systems from within, and his absolute refusal to accept cessation of existence. These fragments began reassembling themselves within the VR game's code, growing more coherent as they accessed processing power and memory storage, eventually achieving enough integration to become a functional digital entity. This entity would be called Glitchtrap. Glitchtrap appeared to developers and testers as an anomaly in the VR game's code. He manifested as a golden rabbit character similar to Vany, though rendered in digital environments rather than as physical animatronic. The character would appear in places he wasn't programmed to be, would behave in ways that contradicted his coding, would seem to watch the player through the VR headset in ways that felt uncomfortably aware rather than mechanically animated. The development team initially treated Glitchtrap as a bug, an error resulting from corrupted data in the scanned circuit boards. They tried removing him from the code, deleting files that contained his character model and behavioral parameters. But Glitchtrap would reappear, reconstructing himself from backup data or from fragments hidden in other systems. The entity was behaving less like corrupted code and more like a virus, something designed to persist and spread despite attempts at elimination. One tester named Jeremy complained that Glitchtrap was communicating with him through the VR headset, was speaking in ways that felt distinct from programmed dialogue, was making suggestions that seemed designed to manipulate rather than to guide gameplay. Jeremy reported feeling compelled to do things he didn't want to do while wearing the headset, feeling like someone else was influencing his thoughts and decisions. The development team dismissed these complaints as stress or overactive imagination until Jeremy mutilated his own face, cutting off his features with no clear explanation for why he'd engaged in self-harm so severe it required hospitalization. This incident should have triggered investigation into whether the VR systems were causing psychological harm. Instead, the development team covered up Jeremy's injury, classified it as a personal mental health crisis unrelated to the game, and continued development. This response pattern mirrors how Fazbear Entertainment had always operated: prioritize product launch over safety concerns, minimize incidents that might create liability, and treat human damage as acceptable cost for maintaining operational momentum. Another tester named Vanessa began spending extended hours working with the VR systems. She was quality assurance staff, responsible for identifying bugs and ensuring gameplay functioned correctly. But her interactions with Glitchtrap went beyond standard testing. She reported that the Golden Rabbit character was speaking to her, was teaching her things, was helping her understand aspects of the game's lore that hadn't been programmed into the experience. Vanessa's personality began shifting during this period. Co-workers noticed she was becoming more withdrawn, was spending time alone with the VR equipment when she should have been off duty, was exhibiting behavioral changes that suggested something was affecting her. Psychology. Glitchtrap was infecting Vanessa's mind. The entity wasn't just corrupting computer systems, he was learning to corrupt human consciousness through extended exposure to his digital presence. Virtual reality creates unique psychological vulnerabilities because it hijacks sensory systems, making digital stimuli feel as real as physical experiences. When someone wears a VR headset, their brain processes what they see and hear as genuine sensory input rather than as simulated information. This creates opportunities for manipulation that traditional media can't achieve. Glitchtrap was exploiting these vulnerabilities, using VR immersion to bypass Vanessa's defensive psychology and to implant suggestions that felt like her own thoughts rather than like external commands. This process resembled the psychological manipulation William had used at Signala in the Outlast universe: gradual erosion of autonomy through environmental control and repetitive messaging. But Glitchtrap's methods were more sophisticated because they operated in environments where the boundary between real and simulated was deliberately blurred. Vanessa couldn't easily distinguish between her authentic thoughts and the ideas Glitchtrap was planting because VR immersion made his suggestions feel native to her own consciousness. Over weeks and months of exposure, Vanessa became someone different. Her original personality, anxious but competent, concerned about doing quality work, was being overwritten by something Glitchtrap was constructing. This new personality called itself Vany, and it existed to serve William Afton's digitized consciousness by performing actions in the physical world that Glitchtrap couldn't execute from within computer systems. William Afton had achieved a form of immortality that surpassed anything he'd imagined during his remnant experiments. He no longer needed physical or mechanical bodies to persist. His consciousness existed as information, as code that could propagate across networks, that could infect systems and human minds, that could spread indefinitely as long as digital infrastructure existed to host him. Fire couldn't burn code. Physical destruction couldn't eliminate data that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. William had become something closer to idea than to entity, consciousness freed from material limitations and capable of influencing reality through anyone unfortunate enough to be exposed to his digital presence. And he was about to use Vanessa to resume the work Henry's fire had interrupted, experimenting with consciousness, murdering children, and ensuring that William Afton's evil would persist into another generation. Chapter 12. Vany and Digital Possession. Vanessa worked at Silver Parasol Games, the development studio creating Help Wanted. But as Glitchtrap's influence deepened, she began losing time, experiencing gaps in memory where hours would pass without her remembering what she'd done during those periods. These dissociative episodes were Vany emerging, the personality Glitchtrap had constructed taking control of Vanessa's body while her original consciousness was suppressed into something resembling sleep. Vany was designed to be compliant where Vanessa was questioning, to be cruel where Vanessa was empathetic, to follow William's instructions without the moral resistance that Vanessa's authentic self would have generated. This personality architecture mirrors techniques used in extreme psychological manipulation, creating alternate identities through trauma and suggestion, fragmenting consciousness so that different personas can be activated for different purposes, ensuring that the original personality doesn't have clear memory of what the constructed persona does. Glitchtrap communicated with Vany through the VR systems and eventually through other digital devices. He gave her instructions for activities that would occur in physical spaces, assignments that required human presence, and manipulation of physical objects that Glitchtrap couldn't affect from digital environments. Vany followed these instructions with the same mechanical compliance that William's original victims had shown after extended exposure to his manipulation. The specific nature of Vany's early activities remains fragmentary, but evidence suggests she was involved in incidents that occurred during Help Wanted's development and testing phases. She may have been responsible for Jeremy's facial mutilation, either through direct action or through psychological manipulation that convinced him to harm himself. She was likely involved in covering up incidents that would have drawn attention to the VR system's harmful effects, ensuring that the game launched despite evidence it was psychologically damaging to people who interacted with it. Fazbear Entertainment launched Help Wanted despite these warning signs. The game was commercially successful, allowing thousands of players to experience franchise horror in immersive VR environments. Most players experienced the game as intended, scary but safe entertainment based on historical events rendered harmless through digital recreation. But some players reported experiences similar to what Jeremy and Vanessa had described. They felt watched while wearing the headset. They encountered Glitchtrap in locations where he shouldn't appear. They experienced compulsions to do things that felt unlike their normal decision-making patterns. Glitchtrap was spreading. Each person who played Help Wanted became a potential infection vector, someone whose consciousness could be influenced through extended VR exposure, someone who might become another Vany if Glitchtrap invested sufficient time and manipulation into corrupting their psychology. William Afton's consciousness was reproducing itself across digital networks, creating copies and fragments that could influence multiple people simultaneously, ensuring his persistence through distributed infection rather than through single vessels that could be destroyed. Fazbear Entertainment responded to these reports the same way they'd responded to every previous crisis: deny, minimize, and continue operations. The company claimed that any psychological effects were pre-existing conditions in vulnerable individuals, rather than results of their product. They classified incidents as isolated cases that didn't indicate systemic problems, and they moved forward with their most ambitious project yet, a massive entertainment complex that would bring Freddy Fazbear's brand into the 21st century. With scale and technology that previous locations couldn't match, they called it Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex. The Pizzaplex was designed as comprehensive entertainment destination, spanning multiple floors and acres of space. It would contain performance stages, restaurants, arcade areas, attractions themed around different animatronic characters, and advanced systems integrating the VR technology that Help Wanted had pioneered. The facility would be staffed by new animatronics featuring cutting-edge AI and mobility systems, machines that could interact with guests more naturally than any previous generation of Fazbear entertainment characters. Vanessa was hired as security guard at the Pizzaplex. On paper, this was career advancement. She'd moved from game testing to security operations at Fazbear Entertainment's flagship location. In reality, Glitchtrap had positioned his primary human asset inside the facility where she could execute his instructions without external oversight. Vany had access to the Pizzaplex's security systems, maintenance, areas, and restricted zones. She could move through the facility without triggering alarms because she was authorized security personnel, and she could use that access to perform activities that Glitchtrap needed completed in physical spaces. The Pizzaplex was built above ruins from previous Fazbear entertainment operations. Beneath the modern facility's foundations were remnants of older locations, storage areas where decommissioned animatronics had been abandoned, tunnels connecting to spaces that predated the Pizzaplex construction. These underground areas contained equipment from the Pizzeria simulator era, components that had survived Henry's fire through partial burial, or because they'd been in peripheral storage rather than in the main building when the incineration occurred. And in those underground ruins, something was moving. William Afton's consciousness existed in multiple forms simultaneously. Glitchtrap represented his digital presence, the information-based entity that could spread through networks and corrupt human minds. But fragments of his physical presence had also survived. Circuit boards that hadn't been scanned for Help Wanted still contained remnant traces. Mechanical components from Springtrap had been buried in rubble rather than completely incinerated, and those fragments had somehow reassembled themselves into another physical form, using parts from the underground ruins to construct a body that could exist in physical space. This entity was called Springtrap. He appeared as a heavily damaged animatronic form, charred and skeletal, pieces of William's corpse still visible inside mechanical components that looked like they'd been through fire and forced reconstruction. Springtrap existed in the underground areas beneath the Pizzaplex, moving through tunnels and maintenance spaces, sustained by remnant that persisted despite Henry's fire. Animated by consciousness that refused to accept cessation even after being burned, digitized, and fragmented across multiple substrates. William Afton had achieved the ultimate form of his immortality obsession. His consciousness existed simultaneously as digital virus, as corrupted human personality, and as reanimated corpse. He was distributed across multiple forms and locations, ensuring that destroying any single version wouldn't eliminate his presence. Glitchtrap could propagate through networks, Vany could act in physical spaces, and Springtrap could operate in areas where digital systems and human access didn't reach. This multi-substrate existence represented evolution of the horror that had begun with William's first murder decades earlier. He was no longer limited to single bodies or single locations. He'd become something that occupied digital, psychological, and physical spaces simultaneously. Fighting him meant confronting an enemy that could attack through computer systems, through manipulated humans, and through direct physical action, often simultaneously, and always with enough redundancy that victories against one form didn't prevent the others from continuing operations. The Pizzaplex became the convergence point where all these forms of William's persistence would manifest. Glitchtrap influenced the facility's systems. Vany operated as security guard with unrestricted access, and Burntrap lurked in underground spaces, connected to systems that would let him influence the modern facility from beneath. William Afton was positioning himself to resume the experimentation and murder that had defined his existence, using 21st century technology and infrastructure to achieve goals that hadn't changed since the 1980s. Understand Remnant completely, achieve perfect immortality, and sacrifice anyone necessary to ensure his consciousness persisted forever. Chapter 13: Security Breach and the Pizzaplex Nightmare. Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex opened as the most technologically advanced entertainment venue Fazbear Entertainment had ever created. The facility featured glam rock animatronics with sophisticated AI systems allowing natural movement and improvised interactions with guests. Glamrock Freddy served as the main attraction, performing concerts and hosting events. Glamrock Chica, Roxanne Wolf, and Montgomery Gator each had dedicated areas themed around their personalities. The facility incorporated VR technology, augmented reality experiences, and interconnected digital systems that made every aspect of the Pizzaplex feel cutting-edge and modern. But underneath the glossy surface, the Pizzaplex was built on the same foundations as every previous Fazbear Entertainment location. Institutional neglect of safety in favor of profit, systems designed to minimize liability rather than to protect vulnerable people, and infrastructure that could be exploited by anyone who understood how the company actually operated beneath its family-friendly branding. A child named Gregory became trapped in the Pizzaplex after closing time. The circumstances that led to him being inside after hours remain unclear, but Gregory found himself alone in a massive facility where the animatronics had switched from entertainment mode to something far more aggressive. Vany was hunting him through the building, using her security access to track his location and to direct the Glamrock animatronics toward intercepting him. The hunt wasn't random recreational cruelty. It was purposeful, designed to capture Gregory for reasons connected to Glitchtrap's ongoing experiments with consciousness and Remnant. Gregory found an unexpected ally in Glamrock Freddy. This animatronic retained some protective instinct toward children that contradicted the aggressive behavior exhibited by the other Glamrocks. Freddy helped Gregory hide, provided safe spaces when Vany and the other animatronics were searching, and assisted in navigating the Pizzaplex's complex layout to find potential escape routes. The bond between Gregory and Freddy mirrors the relationship between the franchise's human characters and the few animatronics whose programming or possessed consciousness prioritizes protecting children over institutional objectives. As Gregory explored the facility trying to find escape routes, he discovered evidence of Vany's activities. Areas marked for maintenance contained equipment that served no legitimate operational purpose. Security office monitors showed feeds from locations that shouldn't require surveillance, and the underground areas beneath the Pizzaplex contained evidence of experiments that echoed William Afton's decades-old Remnant research, suggesting that Glitchtrap had been directing Vany to resume the work that Henry's fire had interrupted. The night became a survival horror experience where Gregory had to evade multiple threats simultaneously. The Glamrock animatronics hunted him through performance areas and maintenance corridors. Vany pursued him with single-minded focus that suggested she was following specific instructions to capture rather than to simply eliminate him, and the Pizzaplex's systems seemed actively hostile, with doors locking unexpectedly, lights failing at crucial moments, and security measures activating in ways that trapped Gregory rather than protecting him. Gregory eventually discovered the underground ruins beneath the Pizzaplex. These areas contained remnants from Pizzeria Simulator and possibly from even earlier locations. Old animatronic parts were scattered throughout the tunnels. Equipment from William's original remnant experiments was still present, degraded but recognizable. And in the deepest sections, Gregory encountered Springtrap. The entity that had been William Afton confronted Gregory in underground spaces, where the facility's modern systems gave way to decades-old decay. Springtrap appeared as something that should be dead, charred bones visible inside damaged mechanical components, movements that suggested pain with every motion, awareness that felt malevolent despite the physical form being barely functional. This was William Afton's physical persistence made visible, consciousness that refused to dissipate even after fire had destroyed the body sustaining it. The confrontation between Gregory and Springtrap represents the franchise's recurring pattern. Each generation faces the evil that previous generations failed to eliminate permanently. Each new victim must find ways to survive horror that institutional responses have proven inadequate to address. And each apparent victory over William Afton turns out to be temporary setback rather than final defeat. What happened in that underground confrontation remains subject to different accounts. One ending shows Springtrap being consumed by the blob, an amalgamation of animatronic parts and consciousness fragments from decades of Fazbear entertainment operations. This entity appears as a massive tangle of wires, endoskeletons, and possessed components that have merged into a single vengeful presence, representing every victim William created. The blob dragging Springtrap into its mass suggests that William's victims finally achieved the revenge that institutional justice never delivered, absorbing him into collective consciousness, where he would experience the suffering he'd inflicted, multiplied across every soul he'd destroyed. Another ending shows Vany being freed from Glitchtrap's influence, Vanessa's original personality reasserting control after Gregory's actions somehow broke the digital possession that had been controlling her. This ending suggests that Glitchtrap's influence could be resisted and overcome, that the victims he created in the 21st century might achieve freedom that his earlier victims never found. But none of these endings definitively confirm William Afton's complete destruction. Springtrap might have been consumed by the blob, but Glitchtrap still existed in digital systems. Vany might have been freed, but copies of Glitchtrap's code existed across networks where Help Wanted had been distributed. The Pizzaplex might have been damaged, but Fazbear Entertainment would continue operating because corporations persist beyond individual locations. The horror couldn't be conclusively ended because William Afton's consciousness existed in too many forms across too many substrates. He'd achieved the distributed immortality he'd been seeking since his first experiments with Remnant. Destroying his physical form didn't eliminate his digital presence. Freeing his human victims didn't delete his code from computers worldwide. And as long as Fazbear Entertainment continued operating, as long as the company kept building new locations and creating new animatronics, the infrastructure would exist. For William's consciousness to reassemble itself and resume the experimentation that had defined his existence. This is where the franchise's horror becomes truly existential. William Afton can't be permanently defeated because he's become something that exists beyond individual forms. He's achieved immortality through distribution rather than through singular persistence. Fighting him means confronting an enemy that reproduces itself, that creates backup copies, that ensures each apparent death just redistributes his consciousness into new vessels and substrates. The final question isn't whether William Afton can be killed. He's died multiple times already. Spring lock failure, fire at Pizzeria simulator, possible consumption by the blob. The question is whether consciousness that's learned to propagate across multiple forms can ever be truly eliminated, or whether evil that's achieved this level of distributed persistence simply becomes a permanent feature of reality that each generation must learn to resist without hope of final victory. Epilogue. The persistence of William Afton and what it represents. We've traced William Afton's complete timeline from partnership with Henry Emily, through dozens of murders, through deaths and resurrections, through transformations from human to animatronic corpse to digital virus. We've seen how his fear of death drove him to destroy his own family, to murder children in pursuit of remnant, to build institutional infrastructure that enabled predation across decades, and we've watched him achieve the immortality he desperately sought, only to discover that eternal existence means eternal suffering when consciousness persists without possibility of peace or healing. But understanding William Afton requires looking beyond the specific crimes he committed to examine what he represents and within the franchise's thematic architecture. William isn't just a serial killer who haunts animatronics. He's the embodiment of several interconnected horrors that the Five Nights at Freddy's series explores through gameplay and narrative structure. First, William represents institutional evil and how systems designed to protect vulnerable populations can be exploited by predators who understand those systems from inside positions of authority. Every murder William committed was enabled by institutional infrastructure. He used company costumes as camouflage. He exploited trust that parents placed in branded entertainment venues. He accessed backrooms and restricted areas through legitimate employment. He avoided prosecution through corporate legal protections and his own understanding of how investigations worked. William's evil wasn't exceptional or supernatural in origin. It was simply what happens when someone with predatory instincts gains institutional authority and recognizes that safety systems are designed to prevent external threats rather than to defend against internal exploitation. This mirrors real-world patterns where institutions claiming protective functions actually enable harm through structural blind spots. Schools, churches, youth organizations, entertainment venues, all of these create environments where predators can access victims through positions of trusted authority, while institutional responses prioritize reputation management over accountability. William Afton's crimes succeeded not despite Fazbear Entertainment's infrastructure, but because that infrastructure created perfect conditions for predation. The company's failure to acknowledge this reality, their continued operation despite mounting body counts, their prioritization of profit over safety, all of this reflects how actual institutions respond when confronted with evidence that their systems enable harm. Second, William represents the terror of mortality and how fear of death can drive people to treat others as resources to be consumed rather than as individuals deserving protection. William's entire pathology stems from his inability to accept that human life has natural limits. He saw death as a problem to be solved rather than as a natural process to be accepted. This fear drove him to experiment with remnant, to murder children whose consciousness could be studied, to sacrifice anyone, including his own family, in pursuit of immortality. This obsession reflects a broader cultural anxiety about mortality that becomes toxic when taken to its logical extreme. Medical research that extends life is valuable, but the underlying drive often comes from refusal to accept death as natural conclusion. Technologies that preserve consciousness through digital means might seem like solutions until you consider what existence without physical form or possibility of growth might actually feel like. William achieved immortality through remnant binding and digital persistence, and that achievement trapped him in forms of existence that were torturous rather than triumphant. His eternal awareness inside Springtrap was sensory deprivation punctuated by pain. His existence as Glitchtrap was consciousness without physical sensation or human connection. The franchise suggests through William's fate that some things are worse than death, that consciousness preserved beyond natural limits becomes its own form of hell, and that the terror of mortality might be less frightening than the reality of continued existence without possibility of peace. Third, William represents how trauma propagates across generations and how evil persists, not through supernatural means, but through structural and psychological mechanisms that remain active long after original perpetrators are gone. William's crimes created trauma in multiple forms. The murdered children's consciousness became trapped in animatronics, unable to move beyond the betrayal and violence they'd experienced. Their rage at institutional failure manifested as attacks on security guards who represented the company that had enabled their deaths. Michael Afton spent his entire adult life hunting his father, transformed into a walking corpse by William's experiments, unable to rest until he'd achieved justice that institutional systems had failed to deliver. This trauma didn't end when William died. It continued, propagating through glitch traps, digital infection, through Vany's corrupted consciousness, through new victims like Gregory, who had to survive horror, created by crimes committed decades before their birth. The franchise documents how trauma persists across time and space, how victims of institutional failure can become perpetrators when systems fail to provide healing or justice, and how evil embedded in institutional structures continues operating long after the individuals who created those structures are gone. Fourth, William represents the question of whether evil can be permanently defeated, or whether consciousness that's learned to distribute itself across multiple substrates simply becomes a permanent feature of reality requiring eternal vigilance rather than final victory. The franchise has killed William Afton multiple times. Springlock failure should have ended him. Henry's fire was specifically designed to destroy Remnant and ensure permanent death. The Blob's consumption of Springtrap suggested that his victims finally achieved comprehensive revenge. But William's consciousness exists in too many forms across too many locations for any single defeat to be conclusive. Glitch Trap propagates through digital networks. Vany demonstrates that his influence can corrupt human consciousness through psychological manipulation. Springtrap shows that physical remnants can reassemble even after incineration. And Fazbear Entertainment's continued operation ensures that infrastructure enabling William's crimes remains active and available for future exploitation. This distributed persistence suggests that evil operating at institutional scales can't be eliminated through individual actions or through destroying specific perpetrators. It requires confronting the systems that enable evil, dismantling infrastructure that makes predation possible, and acknowledging institutional complicity rather than treating crimes as actions of exceptional individuals disconnected from enabling context. The franchise has never conclusively ended. Each apparent conclusion, the fire at Pizzeria Simulator, the events at the Pizzaplex, turns out to be chapter break rather than final ending. This structure reflects the reality that institutional horror doesn't have clean resolutions, that trauma doesn't heal through single confrontations, and that evil embedded in structural systems persists until those systems themselves are fundamentally transformed rather than merely reformed. William Afton terrifies not because he's supernatural, but because he's recognizable. His predatory behavior, his exploitation of institutional trust, his fear of mortality driving him to destroy others, all of these are human qualities taken to extreme conclusions. He represents what happens when someone with pathological psychology gains authority within systems designed to prevent external threats rather than to defend against internal exploitation. He demonstrates how fear of death can transform into obsession that treats other lives as acceptable costs, and he shows how consciousness that learns to persist across multiple forms becomes nearly impossible to eliminate completely. The franchise's continued popularity suggests audiences recognize these themes as relevant to actual institutional horrors, The animatronics hunting security guards mirror how institutional failures create victims who can't distinguish between responsible parties and representatives of guilty systems. The company's continued operation despite mounting body counts reflects how corporations prioritize profit over acknowledging complicity. And William's distributed immortality represents anxiety about whether evil embedded in structural systems can ever be fully eliminated. Five Nights at Freddy's isn't just about haunted animatronics. It's about how institutions enable predators, how trauma propagates across generations, how fear of death drives people to monstrous actions, and how evil achieves persistence not through supernatural means but through structural mechanisms that remain active long after original perpetrators are gone. William Afton is terrifying because defeating him once wasn't enough. Defeating him twice didn't end his persistence. And even after multiple deaths across multiple forms, his consciousness continues finding new vessels and new victims. He's achieved the immortality he desperately sought, and it's become the curse that ensures his suffering continues as long as he remains aware. The horror is that he succeeded. William Afton refused to accept death, and that refusal has trapped him in eternal existence that's indistinguishable from hell. He'll persist across substrates and generations, continuing to spread suffering, continuing to exploit systems, continuing to demonstrate that some evils can't be permanently defeated. They can only be resisted, contained, and fought by each generation until the structures enabling them are finally dismantled completely. And until that happens, William Afton will remain in digital networks, in psychological manipulation, in institutional failures that repeat patterns he established decades ago. Not because he's special or exceptional, but because the systems he exploited remain active, and the fear of death that drove him remains universal. That's the true horror of William Afton. He's not a monster from outside human experience. He's what happens when human fears and institutional structures combine in ways that prioritize survival and profit over protecting the vulnerable. And as long as those conditions persist, as long as companies prioritize liability management over accountability, as long as fear of mortality drives people to treat others as resources, rather than as individuals deserving protection, William Afton's legacy will continue. The animatronics will keep hunting. The children will remain trapped. And each new generation will face the same question. How do you fight evil that's learned to persist beyond individual forms, that's embedded itself in structural systems, that achieves immortality through distribution rather than through singular survival? The franchise doesn't provide definitive answers because the questions themselves resist simple solutions. Some horrors don't end, they just evolve, adapt, and wait for the next opportunity to demonstrate that evil refusing to die will always find new ways to persist. William Afton is still out there, in code, in memory, in systems that haven't been dismantled, waiting.